Welcome back to Decouple. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Chris Adlam. Chris is a board member of Canadians for Nuclear Energy and an expert on Canada's nuclear sector. Chris, take a second, introduce yourself, and then we're going to have a quick chat about a recent Globe and Mail article by Matthew McLean entitled, what's the title again? More than half of Canada's can't, wait, no, that's a different line. Sorry. Nuclear reactor pressure tubes are deteriorating faster than expected. Critics warn regulators are breaking their own rules. So first off, Chris, just take a moment to introduce yourself a little further, and let's jump into the heart of the story.
Okay. Yeah, as most people know, I'm a director for C4NE. I work in the healthcare industry and IT, but I've had a passion for nuclear energy for more than a decade. And family-wise, my grandfather and his father were both engineers for GE and hydroelectric. So this interest runs deep.
Sure. I think we figured out that our ancestors might have worked on some of the same hydro
That's
projects back in the day, but that's an anecdote for another time. So, Chris, we both read this article. It's kind of hot off the press. What are your kind of immediate reactions, and then let's dig in a little bit to help our listenership who may or may not be familiar with the Candu design to understand what we're talking about here. And some of the context. So first off, what's your sort of reaction reading this article?
Well, what jumps out to me initially, this guy seems like he's a merchant of doubt, right? Sowing seeds about the integrity or lack thereof of our federal nuclear regulator, which is just awful. And the motivation seems, rather nefarious. He didn't consult with any of the actual industry. Right? He quoted the Ontario Clean Air Alliance, which is two bloody people, neither of which who have expertise in this at all. And then the person that they often quote, which is ridiculous, actually two people that they often quote, did not reach out to Bruce Power, did not reach out to Kinetrics, did not reach out to OPG, and didn't even reach out to the CNSC. Right? The information that they posted from the CNSC is from an information request. Right? So they didn't contact anybody at the CNSC to get context or anything that would really add some value and maybe make this a more balanced piece. As it stands, it's totally unbalanced, and it just comes off as anti-nuclear fear porn.
All right, so I mean, let's get to the heart of what the article is alleging, and this is this idea that Candu pressure tubes are deteriorating faster than expected. Let's start off again for those of our international audience and even those Canadians who are not super familiar with the Candu design. What we're talking about. Give us a little orientation of the key bits of the Candu, what makes it different, and what pressure tubes are.
Well, so in its most basic, the Candu consists of a calandria, right, which is a massive water-filled vessel that's penetrated by these tubes, calandria tubes, and inside the calandria tubes are pressure tubes. And the pressure tubes are kept off of the calandria tubes by annulus spacers. And the space between the pressure tube and the calandria tube is the annulus space. And this is filled with a gas, either nitrogen or CO2, it doesn't really matter. And this gas is constantly sampled for any signs of moisture, which would give you an indication that there's some sort of leak. The pressure tubes and the calandria tubes, this whole situation, the whole calandria is located horizontally. This was a design choice, an intentional design choice for safety. So you need multiple things in order for fission to take place in a Candu reactor, right? You need deuterium, right? You need that heavy water moderator because natural uranium will not fission without heavy water. And then you need to have the fuel bundles oriented straight across to maintain this chain reaction. So our research reactors were located vertically. And like an American plant, right, where the fuel is loaded in from the top. So, but they didn't have a pressurized coolant. So with the Candu, the design choice was made to locate things horizontally, and the reason for that was a safety thing, right? So if you ever did have an overheat event, the tube would sag, and it would kill the reaction. And if you lose that deuterium moderator, it also kills the reaction. right? And then everything is located in this gigantic vat of water.
And that's heavy water as well. Is that correct?
Yes. And so that's a safety feature as well, right? You have all of this water that creates these layers of safety, and then you have your makeup water in a massive tank. In a Candu 6, it's located in the top of the reactor building. At Pickering, it's located in the top of the vacuum building. And there's this water can be used to flood the steam generators and passively cool the units in the event that you had a complete site black.
So, in terms of the Candu reactor, I've been told that it's, again, the safety record for nuclear is pretty exemplary. There have been some incidents. We've done some episodes before on the health consequences of, for example, Chernobyl with the Chernobyl Tissue Bank director, Dr. Geraldine Thomas. That's worth looking into because, as folks may have noticed, there's huge variability in terms of the estimates of the consequences of these accidents and big differences in terms of the scientific methodology employed in those studies. So worth jumping back there rather than dwelling on that today. But you were mentioning there that the Candu has passive features. It seems to be a reactor that it's a lot more forgiving in the event of something going wrong.
Yeah,
Why don't you go into that just a little bit?
Yeah, because you have these 3 layers of water, right? Like a BWR has 1 layer of water, right? Because your moderator is your steam generator. And PWR has 2 layers of water. I think the EPR has 3, but the Candu also has the calandria. So you have this massive vat of water that's just basically sitting there. That's not part of your heat transport system, but it provides that heat sink capability. So there's a ton of passive safety features just in the design alone. And then there's the idea that, the unit itself can be passively cooled using the steam generators as a heat sink. And that's, again, due to the volume of water that you have available and due to the pressure tube style design, right? Think of it's like a radiator because you don't have the kettle that's sitting there. You have all of these tubes, and the water is going to want to follow a path of convection.
Right. And we've talked before about, in the hype around modular reactors. I mean, Candu is the only reactor with a modular core. So when we're talking about this kind of inherent safety, it's partially because all the fuel's not sort of tightly packed in together. You have, I think I've done the math on this once before, but 480 channels divided by 880 megawatt, each channel is essentially like I forget what it was. I think a 1.8 megawatt reactor. Is that an accurate way to look at it?
Or that's a great way to look at it. And that's how the core is managed too, right? Like the center of the core is hotter than the periphery. And that actually kind of dovetails with some of this that we're going to discuss. But that's why they shuffle the fuel around, because the center of the core is hotter than the outside. So they are constantly moving the fuel around to optimize burnup.
So, one of the things about running a style of reactor in Canada's case, I think just over 5 decades now, is, gaining operational experience. And I think that's something that's a little bit overlooked in the race, perhaps, in the kind of fetishization of, new first of a kind or advanced reactors. With each design, over decades of operation, we learn, how to optimally operate these things. And there's some hiccups along the way. So in terms of concerns around pressure tubes, what's the kind of reference point in terms of some of the key learning points that inform, our risk analysis for pressure tube integrity?
Well, there's some early observations that happened at Douglas Point, but really the biggest event that we had was the 1983 pressure tube split at Pickering. And that was a result of the annulus spacer, which is, as I mentioned earlier, what keeps the pressure tube off the calandria tube, migrating to the other end of the unit right near the end fitting and no longer supporting the tube. So the tube sagged.
Okay. So I used to think, in my early days here, that the spacers were sort of in between each of the pressure tubes, holding the geometry of the pressure tubes and the calandria. That's clearly not true. Again, you have your fuel bundle, which is kind of the shape essentially of a wooden log. Those are loaded into the pressure tube. And then, so that's one of the metal tubes. Then you have this gas space, and then you have, an outer tube, which is the calandria tube.
Correct.
So just to kind of reaffirm that for people, the spacer device is in that gas-filled annulus space, which prevents pressure tube from touching the calandria.
Yeah, and the calandria tubes run cold, right? Because they're sitting in the calandria, which is full of water. The pressure tubes, with that gap between the pressure tube and the calandria tube, the pressure tubes run quite hot.
And again, the heat transfer system is water going around those fuel bundles within the pressure tube at high pressure. Yeah, through the fuel bundles at high pressure. And then the water on the outside of the calandria tube within the calandria vessel itself. I think a lot of people might think that that's a high pressure environment, but that's a low pressure environment full of lots and lots and lots of heavy water, correct?
Yep. And it's stationary. It doesn't move. It's not circulated. The calandria is just full of water.
All right. Carry on. So what happened at Pickering 1983?
Well, the early pressure tubes, which was again something that we kind of figured out based on this event and some of the data that was aggregated from Douglas Point, the Zirc alloy 2 tubes, they have a higher level of virgin hydrogen in them. So they aged quicker than anticipated. This was identified quite early on, but it did cut short the life of those tubes. And so only the Pickering A units, beyond Douglas Point, used that alloy. An improved alloy was developed. After that, Pickering B was that alloy. Darlington's that alloy. Bruce is that alloy. So it was only the Pickering A units, the ones that started construction in 1966. And this event led to the complete retubing of Pickering A with the updated alloy. But anyways, the event hinged on the fact that the pressure tube contacted the calandria tube. And this isn't something that just happened. It's not like, oh, well, the pressure tube sagged, touched the calandria tube, and it split. No, this was like up to 10 years of contact where the two surfaces produced this high concentration of hydrogen because of the heat, right? The heat transported from the pressure tube to the calandria tube. And it kind of created this high heat area, which increased the rate of hydrogen uptake, and it created this brittle spot. And eventually, after around 10 years, this created a crack, and the pressure tube split. And there were some defects around this area that resulted in the crack, blisters, again, as a result of this high level of hydrogen uptake and the reaction that was taking place between the pressure tube and the calandria tube. So you have multiple factors in play here. You have this inferior pressure tube material, which is no longer in use. You have the contact between the pressure tube and the calandria tube, which we now check for. We check for the relocation of the annulus spacers. And if they have moved, we move them back. So that's not something that happens currently. You can't have that contact. We check for it and adjust for it, which wasn't happening in 1983. And you have these blisters that were a result of this. So all of these factors work together over a 10-year period to produce, up to 10-year period to produce this event. And the event itself was a nothing burger.
Right. So let's talk about what happened. So again, and maybe we'll try and get some visuals up here, at least in the show notes. So the pressure tube cracked. And I think it was like a 1 meter.
It was a 2 meter long split that originated at the contact point and worked its way towards one of the end fittings.
So then water at 17 kilograms per second, which sounds like a lot, but we're talking about heat transfer system moving just an insane amount of water. In any case, heavy water goes from the pressure vessel into the annulus space.
Correct.
Is that right? And then was contained in the annulus space
into another tube.
Okay, so into that circumferential space around the pressure tube. It didn't rupture through the calandria tube and
no. The calandria tube observed no damage. They did see some basically wear marks where the contact had been happening, but there was no structural damage to the calandria tube whatsoever.
So what happens in that setting? Like the 17 kilograms of heavy water per second is,
and then some of it spilled out the bellows at the end. The bellows were not watertight. They were supposed to be, but they were not watertight. So some of it came out, landed on the fueling machine, prevented it from working for a little bit. But the incident ultimately was a nothing burger. They just dropped in the shutdown rods and shut down the unit, and it went offline.
I heard that the emergency systems weren't even activated.
It's a planned for event. Like the design allows for these sort of events to potentially happen, or you have to plan for worst case scenarios. So we do plan for pressure tube breaches and loss of cooling incidences and all of that stuff. But in terms of the actual severity of this event, it was extremely mild. As you note, they didn't even have to use the emergency shutdown system; they just shut it down normally.
So, obviously, a lot was learned from that event, both, I guess, in terms of,
Well,
operations
yes,
and, operator skill.
they went looking for other. So once they realized what had happened, they went looking for other fuel channels that had experienced the same thing, and they found several. And that's what led to the practice we have now, where they locate the annulus spacers and make sure they're where they need to be. They have updated the annulus spacer design since then, so the refurbished units have a different annulus spacer than the non-refurbished units, um, but they still check the locations of them.
Okay. So there's a number of new inspection tools that have been developed over the years to ascertain,
Absolutely.
how the pressure tubes are doing. Tell me about those.
Well, there's the one that goes through and locates the annulus spacers, as we just discussed, and then uses a pulse to bounce them back to where they're supposed to be. We also have the scrape probes that go in, take samples, random intervals, or specific locations within the pressure tube if they have an area of interest, which does tie into this conversation, and essentially looking for higher levels of hydrogen uptake in these locations, which is what's used to dictate the life of the pressure tubes, is this hydrogen concentration.
Okay, well, why don't we, fast forward to where we are now and the subject of this article. I mean, so this is not this is an article that's following up on essentially Bruce Power, one of the three large Candu facilities in Ontario, discovering and reporting to the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission that they detected a higher than expected and above the regulatory limit level of hydrogen concentration in the pressure tubes. Can you explain that in a little more detail?
Yeah, I mean, so Bruce was disassembling Unit 6, taking it apart for refurbishment. And they were inspecting the pressure tubes, looking for anything that, maybe they didn't catch while the unit was in service. And they discovered a hotspot near one end of the pressure tube. It was a space about the size of a nickel that had much higher concentration than they anticipated, and higher than the average for the tube. So the average for the tube was within the regulatory limit, but this one little hotspot was way above that.
Did that hotspot in any way, correspond to the Pickering Unit 2 1983 incident in terms of its size, shape,
No,
location?
not
anything
even
like
related.
that?
And that's the thing, right? Is when they're doing sampling, they're typically going for areas that they expect to have higher levels of concentration, closer to the center, closer to where, you have the highest levels of neutron flux, right? They aren't going to check where you have low levels of neutron flux. You wouldn't expect to see high levels of hydrogen uptake there. In this case, it was right where the pressure tube met the end fitting. And it was on the top of the tube, just outboard from the, what's the heck's it called? Um, it's essentially the interface that holds the pressure tube and the end fitting on the pressure tube. And it was just outboard from that, almost right on the edge. And it was a small nickel-sized spot. Bruce Power actually released a presentation that showed the area of interest, which was the top quarter of the tube, basically, and then the actual concentrations within that area. And it was a tiny little spot. So, unlike the incident at Pickering, where you had this large, elongated section of high hydrogen uptake to the point where it was creating blisters on the tube itself, at Bruce, you have this very tiny spot that doesn't propagate outward from that at all. There's no radiation of, or that's probably not the greatest word to use in this sense, but the high level was very, very focused. Then there were no defects in that location, no marks. There was absolutely no possible way for that part of the pressure tube to contact the calandria tube either, because it's right at the end fitting, and the end fitting is fixed, right? So there's no chance of anything, of any sort of crack propagating from that high uptake spot. And that's what was determined by both Bruce's analysis and the CNSC, who reviewed all of the data and was like, yeah, this does not pose a safety risk. And so then they observed a similar but far less severe high level of uptake in the same location in a pressure tube in Unit 3, which was off for maintenance but was planned on going back online. And based on the determination that it posed no risk to the safety operation of the unit, they allowed Unit 3 to return to service.
And Unit 3, I think, is coming off for refurbishment next year, 2023.
Yes, Unit 3 is the next Bruce unit to go down for refurb.
So I think, one of the elements of this article, is kind of calling into question the entire fleet. It does go into some depth and does mention, where the defect was found. But I think the takeaway you might get from the article is that, they refer to the congenital defect of the Candu reactor, which is, hydrogen uptake in pressure tubes. So maybe respond to that a little bit and your comments on, how this finding at Bruce is relevant to the rest of the Candu fleet.
Well, it's not. This has only been observed at Bruce. If it had happened at Darlington, they'd be making hay about it happening at Darlington. It hasn't happened at Darlington. And we've had one unit completely refurbished, and we've had two others that are already down for refurb and had their PTs removed. If it was an issue at Darlington, we would know by now. There's no mention of this happening with the Pickering units when they were retubed. So this seems to be a Bruce
and we're again just to be specific, we have an A side of Pickering which has 4 units. We have a B side with 4 units. 2 of the units at A side are currently mothballed, and 2 they were retubed.
All of them were retubed.
Retubed 2 times though, right? In after this incident, and then as part of their partial refurbishment.
No, they had the partial refurbishment didn't include a retube. It was
okay because they'd done it in the 80s.
Correct. The hydrogen uptake levels were so low there was absolutely no point in doing it.
So what's going on at Pickering? We hear all the time it's the oldest Candu facility in Canada, or at least the oldest operating one. And how is it doing? Are its tubes how do they look compared to the other?
Well, amusingly, Pickering has the lowest levels of hydrogen uptake. And the reason for that is the lower level of neutron flux in the core. So there are 2 metrics we use for analyzing pressure tube age, essentially, right? The absolute thing we're concerned about is hydrogen uptake, right? Because that's what creates the embrittlement. And that's what pressure tubes are designed to leak before break. That's the safety thing. Is so the annulus gas is designed to pick up any sort of water or any sort of moisture content, right? It's constantly being sampled. And if it picks up moisture, you shut down the unit and you go looking for why it's picking up moisture, right? Because that could be a leak in the tube, and which is a sign of failure. So that's the failure model that it's supposed to follow. The risk with the hydrogen uptake is that once it gets sufficiently embrittled, the tube may split before it leaks, right? So you want leak before break, but if you get too much hydrogen in the tube, it'll break before it leaks. And you basically are recreating that 83 Pickering failure, which is what you're trying to avoid. So that's why we monitor the hydrogen uptake levels. So the hydrogen uptake levels are predicted based on the full power hours of the unit. Essentially, there's a model that figures, we have X number of hours on this tube. That corresponds with about this level of hydrogen. And the condemnation limit's 120 ppm. I think it was 100 ppm before, but it got bumped up to 120. And so that's sort of the condemnation point. And it's obviously a conservative value. But at Pickering, because of the lower level of neutron flux, and there's a bit of a nuclear history thing here. So when the Bruce design started to being developed, which was before Pickering B was constructed, they increased the number of fuel elements in the bundles. So they went from 28 to 37.
And so again, just for listeners that aren't as familiar, we have this fuel bundle that looks like a kind of skinny log of wood. And it is made up of a number of, I guess we'll keep using the wood analogy of very straight sticks.
Yeah, they're pins.
Arranged in pins they're referred to, or pencils, I believe.
Yep. Or elements.
Yeah, Yeah. Okay. Arranged in like concentric circular rings,
Yep,
from the outside
correct.
in. Like rings of a tree. This wood analogy is quite
And
good.
they're packed full of uranium dioxide pellets.
Okay. And in Pickering, there's I think
28,
28, and in Bruce and Darlington 20,
37.
or sorry, 30, 37. Okay. So there's a lot more fuel packed
Yes,
into the
and then
same
the CanFlex
sized.
bundle I think is 43.
Wow. Okay.
um, but yeah, this is the standard 480 fuel channel, and the Candu 6 bundle has the 37 element design. Pickering inherited the bundles from Douglas Point. So Pickering A's heat transport system, it's not that the units of Pickering are incapable of handling the higher number of element bundles. It's the heat transport system at the plant was designed based on using the 28 element bundle. And then when Pickering B was built, even though Pickering B was based on the Candu 6, which used the 37 element bundle, the heat transport system was a copy of Pickering A. So they couldn't use the higher output bundles. So it continued to use the 28 element bundles. So the 28 element bundles produce lower levels of neutron flux. There's less flux in the core. Less flux in the core means lower hydrogen uptake in the pressure tubes, which extends their life. So the pressure tubes at Pickering just simply do not age in line with the model. They do not age in line with the number of full power hours that you expect to see, and what we do see at Darlington. So Darlington's refurb schedule does correspond very well with 120 ppm limit, and that meshes with the full power hours. But that has not happened at Pickering. And if you look at the number of full power hours, then you look at the hydrogen concentrations, it's like these do not line up at all. Which is great for Pickering. Means we're allowed to continue to run the station. It's safe to continue operating. But it also means that any sort of observations made with respect to the lifespan of Pickering, they're typically made in error.
So just to get a sense of some numbers, the regulatory limit is 120 parts per million. That nickel-sized spot on the Bruce tube at Unit 6 was 212, I think.
At its peak, it was 212. The spot itself kind of varied somewhere between 140 and 180 or something like that.
And what are some of the Pickering samplings, the most recent Pickering samplings?
Hold on, I actually have that handy. All right, so if we look at the 2020 figures, the end of 2020, October 2020, Darlington Unit 1, for example, was at 114 with 212,000 full power hours. And we're not going to look at Pickering A units because we know those pressure tubes have been replaced. But if we look at, let's say, Pickering Unit 6, 250,000 full power hours. So significantly higher, right? 77 parts per million hydrogen uptake. Way lower. And in fact, the highest at Pickering at that time was Pickering Unit 5, had 243,000 full power hours, and it was only 84. And so if you look at the original end of life projections for Pickering, which was supposed to be December of 2024, the B units, none of them broke 100. The highest again was Pickering Unit 5, and they were showing 97. And that's with 287,000 full power hours. And in fact, if you look at Unit 6, which is showing 295,000 full power hours, they're seeing 90. So they're nowhere near end of life.
Interesting, because that's what we hear frequently, right? Pickering is the kind of the subtitle in the news is it's Canada's oldest nuclear plant, and that's because of the A side units were built earliest, correct? Can you just quickly walk us through the age thing? The A side units have been retubed, so
yeah,
that's the critical thing. And just also, you mentioned in a previous conversation, this idea I'd mentioned that refurbishment restores, the Candu to, an as new condition. You disputed that. So, answer me those little questions.
Well, yeah. So the A units are the oldest in the fleet, right? The construction started on A in 1966. The B units are actually newer than Bruce A and about the same age as Bruce B. So they're not that old. And the B units are the ones that are currently under evaluation for being refurbished. They are Candu 6s. They are identical to the Candu 6 except for the heat transport system, which was a clone of the A, which has no impact on the longevity of the units other than the fact that we do have to replace the boilers. We're already doing that at Bruce. That process has been mastered already. So there's no concern about doing that. OPG had already planned for that when they originally had drafted the refurbishment plan for Pickering B.
In 2009?
Yes, correct. Yeah.
Okay.
And then abandoned it due to the political climate at the time, right? It was nothing to do with the technical feasibility of the project. There were two concerns. One, that it was going to coincide with the Darlington refurbishment. They'd have both plants offline at once, which seems silly based on the pressure tube data, aging data that we have, and the fact that we've been able to continue extending Pickering based on this data. And Darlington, on the other hand, did have to be done when it was done. And of course, as I noted, the political situation, OPG was trying to build Darlington B at that time. And I think they thought that if they gave up on trying to refurbish Pickering, they'd be allowed to build Darlington B, which of course we know Kathleen Wynne scuttled, and that never happened.
So now let's just talk quickly about refurbishment, because again, the article, I wouldn't say it overtly does this. I mean, there's an infographic, and it's basically saying that, you know, the operational lifespan of Candu's is 30 years, and so,
which is wholly incorrect. Yeah. So
a number and a number of, you know, plants are in what are called quote unquote extended operations. So to talk about, we've sort of talked about the extended operations at Pickering and the rationale for that in terms of the slower aging of the pressure tubes. But, you know, hit on that for a second, and then just explain refurbishment to me.
Okay.
Help me understand that
the
better.
Candus were designed with a 60-year lifespan, with the midlife refurbishment happening at about 30 years. Right? These are nominal figures. They are not figures that are, you know, set in stone. As we've discovered with the US PWR fleet, 60 years is now 80 years. Right? And with the optimization of these extended runs like we're seeing at Bruce, you know, you're looking at 90 plus years that you can get out of these plants, because you're replacing the entire heart of the unit when you're doing these refurbishments. You're replacing all
what's
pressure tubes.
There's a Greek legend about a boat. I forget, it's like the Thesean boat or something, where, you know, you're replacing every plank on the boat to the point that there's no old planks, but the boat has the same shape. It kills me. I can't remember the metaphor here, the name for that.
Yeah, that does sound that sounds similar here. Yeah. And it's important to note that the pressure tubes that we're using now are of an even newer design than the pressure tubes that the plants were built with, which were an improvement over the previous pressure tubes. So these are expected to last even longer. But you're not only replacing the pressure tubes, right? American reactors receive, during their life, various upgrades. Like they replace the steam generators, they do control system upgrades, they maybe do a turbine upgrade, right, and do an upgrade. All of this stuff kind of happens at the same time with the Candu, because you have that 30-year window where you know the unit's going to be offline for 2 years, approximately. You do all of that stuff at that time. So what we saw with Bruce Unit 1 and 2, they have the highest capacity factor in the entire fleet at over 90%, right? So they received a number of critical upgrades that greatly improved their performance. And so, you know, per your point about my comment with respect to being as good as new, no, they're significantly better than new, right? The controls are improved, the pressure tubes are improved. At Bruce, they're also doing uprates. So, you know, the Bruce units 1 and 2 right now are producing around 825 megawatts each. They were originally producing 750. So these are significant improvements. They did an HP turbine upgrade at Pickering 5, after which it produced 560 megawatts. It's originally 516, sorry. So, you know, these are the sorts of improvements that we can expect to see after a refurbishment. So the units are better than new.
And, you know, the article brought up Point Lepreau, for instance, New Brunswick.
And which was already refurbished. So I don't even know why they would mention that. The pressure tubes at Lepreau are new. And they lasted their intended design.
Not an issue. So Darlington, not an issue. Point Lepreau, not an issue. Pickering, not an issue. And Bruce is retubing the units that have high levels, you know, right now. And
Bruce is a very unique plant. We have to kind of keep that in mind. Bruce has some unique features that maybe make some things that we've observed there not applicable to the rest of the fleet. And it's not a knock at the plant. It's a fantastic plant. It's the highest output site in North America. It was for the longest time the largest nuclear power plant in the world. But Bruce was basically the beta test for what was built at Darlington. It was the beta test for the Candu 9. And so there was some learning experiences that happened there. It was also used as the design basis for the Candu 6. The reduced number of pumps, the reduced number of steam generators, all of those features. Oh, and the 37 element fuel bundle, all of those made their way into the Candu 6 design as improvements over the Pickering design that it was originally supposed to be based on. So it was very much a proving ground for new technology, and not all of that stuff ended up being successful. Can't remember if it was 1 or 2 units at Bruce A, but they had fixed end fittings. So you couldn't account for fuel channel growth, which is another thing that's kind of a mitigating factor here. Sorry, not mitigating, determining factor in pressure tube life. Yes, we have our hydrogen uptake. We have our full power hours, which is supposed to correlate with the hydrogen uptake, but you also have fuel channel growth. So they can only get so long, and then they potentially come off the bearing pads at the end. So that may ultimately be what dictates the pressure tube life of the Pickering B units. They might hit that point before they hit the hydrogen concentration level. But if the refurbishment plan goes ahead, you would likely see that happen in 2025, 2026 anyways, which it seems like it's more than capable of hitting anyways. But anyways, to get back to that, Bruce has some unique features. So some of the things we observe at Bruce aren't necessarily applicable to the other plants. So as I mentioned earlier, we haven't seen these hot spots on the pressure tubes out of Darlington. It was never mentioned about Pickering when it was retubed, and it was never mentioned at Point Lepreau when it was retubed. So clearly this is a Bruce specific phenomenon.
Okay, so I guess just in closing, it was interesting seeing who Matthew McLaren quoted. 2 figures, I think Frank Greening and Sunil Nijhawan. Both I think Frank's retired from the nuclear industry, but was involved apparently in pressure tube inspections. And Sunil Nijhawan, I was just Googling these folks to learn more about them, and they appear in a number of articles by Matthew McLaren, as well as frequently consulted by Ontario Clean Air Alliance. Certainly, qualifications. They have qualifications, and I don't really want to go into details, in terms of their personal histories, etc. But Sunil Nijhawan was quoted as saying, basically this was back several years ago at the Pickering station, where there was some issues with calibration of hydrogen measurements, I believe. That there's a situation at Pickering that could lead to, essentially a Fukushima style situation. So I just wanted to unpack that in the time we have left.
That's fear porn. I mean, Fukushima was caused by a tsunami, which took away the backup generators. So the plant had no cooling whatsoever, right? You're not
and there's a boiling water reactor again. Yeah.
So, I mean, it's impossible for that situation to happen. That's the short version.
Sure. What's the slightly extended version? I mean, we've talked about it a little bit, I guess, in terms of comparing
the amount of water and the pressure tube design just simply doesn't lend itself to that sort of situation. But one of the big issues that happened at Fukushima wasn't the reactor; it was the spent fuel pool, right? Boiling off the water, and they had no way of replenishing it because they had no power, they had no pumps. We don't have that problem. We can't have that problem because we can't have a tsunami on the Great Lakes. So, I mean, the required events to lead to a Fukushima-style incident are impossible. There was an article written shortly after Fukushima that delved into, had the Japanese built Candus instead of BWRs, would the event have been avoided? And goes into it in some depth. It's actually quite an interesting read because Japan was in talks with AECL about building C6s, and then the U.S. intervened and basically said, no, you're using our design. It's in your best interest. So kind of strong-armed Japan into going with the BWR.
Okay, Chris, well, we intended to just do this in 30 minutes. We've gone 10 minutes over our goal there. I forgive you. I hope you forgive me. It's a beautiful Saturday afternoon. I think we're going to sign off here, but I hope that was interesting for our listenership. And certainly if there's any feedback, if there's anything that we got wrong, I think that's unlikely, but certainly possible. Looking forward to generating that conversation. Really, I think, the motivation for this podcast is, the Globe and Mail article went into quite a few details. And the responses we saw from the CNSC in particular were pretty brief. I think the public's curious. And so, exploring some of these details in depth is worthwhile. I will note Bruce Power had a statement which was brief, but it linked to their website, and they've got a lot of detail posted there in their publicly available submissions to the CNSC. So if you're interested, we'll throw that stuff in the show notes, and you can check that out. But I think this is just an issue of public concern, and I guess my intention here is just let's get it out of the closet and talk about it, and hear different opinions. So we've got the Chris Adlam take today. Feel free to comment, wherever you're seeing this, whether it's on Twitter or Facebook or LinkedIn. Really looking forward to having an interesting conversation about this. So again, Chris, thank you for coming on and sharing your quite in-depth level of knowledge, and look forward to doing more of the same.
Thank you for having me, Chris.
But next time we'll fix your camera so we're not just seeing your nose and eyes. We'll get that glorious beard in there as well.